So I'm going to cover some of the highlights of planning history now. So this is about planning movements, influences on planning. It really covers a broad range of topics related to actual planning practice. Let's get started. Some important acts in planning history: the Ordinance of 1785, the Homestead Act, the Morrill Act, and the General Land Law Revision Act. The Land Ordinance Act really was about sort of laying out the initial way in which the continent would be inhabited by white settlers. The idea originally was sort of laying out these squares. Obviously, this has a certain weakness in that it kind of ignored the topography, but also the people that were already there. Related is the Homestead Act that really involved a lot of people sort of being encouraged to move west. The Morrill Act in 1862. And the General Revision Act, which really was sort of the beginning of things like the National Forest Service. The Standard State Zoning Enabling Act and the Standard City Planning Enabling Act are definitely things to touch on as you study this area. Knowing about the layout of Washington, D.C., really one of America's first planned cities. The idea that Pierre L'Enfant laid out sort of a concept for Washington, D.C. originally. Similarly, in Europe, Paris had a similar effort that happened later in the 1800s. And laid out these grand boulevards. So knowing that basic idea of these sort of grand concepts for communities. The City Beautiful movement and Daniel Burnham's ideas in terms of how cities could just really be wonderful places that could draw people in. The White City and the World Columbian Exposition. The idea of the L'Enfant's plan for Washington really sort of came back in the early 20th century and continued to be implemented. And then the Great Chicago Plan of 1909, of course, the Make No Small Plans plan. Ebenezer Howard had the idea of garden cities around 1898, the book The Garden Cities of Tomorrow in 1902, and he really laid out 3 garden cities in his time, so at least being familiar with the names of those is probably helpful. And this is just an example from one of the garden cities. And then the city functional, which is sometimes called the city efficient or the city scientific. This is in the early 20th century when scientific management was taking off in all areas of the country. But this was the idea that cities also could take advantage of this scientific management idea. The National Conference on City Planning in 1909, the founding of the American Planning Institute in 1917, various documents that are related to that are on this slide, and the idea that sort of you could create a sort of a machine that is a city. And the idea that there's some overlap with the City Beautiful and some potential conflict there. Looking at the history of zoning, the original idea in New York City that there was issues with light, there was issues from unwanted use. The New York City Zoning Code in 1916, which may not have been the first zoning code in the country, but certainly was one of the most comprehensive, divided New York into commercial, residential, and unrestricted districts, had height restrictions for the first time, came up with the idea of setback design and the idea that buildings should be set back further as they go higher up to protect light down on the street. And then Edward M. Bass is a name I always forget. One of sort of the fathers of zoning who really came up with a lot of the original zoning schemes even before the federal government came up with standard acts. Herbert Hoover, as Secretary of Commerce, came up with the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act in 1924. Definitely something to keep in mind. In 1926, the U.S. Supreme Court case, Euclid versus Ambler, that upheld the idea that zoning was legal from a national level. It hadn't really been tested until that time. And once that was established, communities all over the country started adopting zoning codes, some later than others, but over the next 30 years, a lot of communities introduced zoning. Knowing a little bit about the regional plan of New York and its environs is important. Knowing about the original regional plan in 1929, the neighborhood unit in Clarence Perry, some of the other pieces that are related to this sort of movement and how it led to other regional plans in other parts of the country. The Regional Planning Association of America that was founded in 1923 really, again, also helped advance this concept. Knowing about suburban expansion generally, the Greenbelt near Washington, D.C. in 1937 was sort of the first sort of planned suburb, not that there hadn't been other suburbs before then. Green Hills near Cincinnati and Greendale near Milwaukee were similar, sort of at that same basic era in the late 30s. And the idea that there's sort of 3 interrelated policies that really helped spur suburbanization. Suburban housing through various federal ways of funding housing finance over the 30s and 40s. The preference for the automobile and the building of roads at public expense that really helped encourage people to live further away from the downtown. And various regional infrastructure, things like the Tennessee Valley Authority. The idea that these suburbs needed power, they needed sewer, they needed water. They didn't just sort of appear out of whole cloth. There's a lot of public infrastructure that went into making them possible. One is transportation, but there are others not to forget.